My husband filed for divorce at 74 and married his secretary. I'm taking all the property and you'll get $500 a month from me. Be grateful, he said. I left silently. 3 months later, his new wife checked the bank account and went pale. All his $12 million fortune actually belonged to... Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me what the secret to a long marriage was. 51 years with Donald Harrison, and I had learned to smile at that question. Patience, I used to say. A lot of patience. And they would laugh, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. We had built everything together. Or so I believed for most of those years. Donald ran the front office of Harrison Property Group, shaking hands with investors, signing contracts, taking clients to dinner at places where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people's grocery budget. He was good at that. He had the voice, the handshake, the silver hair that made wealthy men trust him instinctively. What he was never quite as good at was the actual work, the spreadsheets, the tax structures, the legal architecture that kept everything standing. That was me. I had a degree in accounting from the University of Virginia, class of 1972, and for 30 years, I managed the financial backbone of everything we owned. Not as a named partner. Donald felt it looked better if the business had one face, but as the woman behind every document that mattered. Our home in McLean, Virginia, was beautiful. 4 bedrooms, a garden I had planted myself over 3 decades, a kitchen where I cooked Sunday dinners for our daughter Patricia and later, her children. It was a quiet, orderly life, and I had loved it honestly. I noticed the first change in 2021. Donald had always worked long hours. That was nothing new. But something in the texture of his absences shifted. He started locking his phone. He had never locked his phone in 50 years of marriage. Then came the cologne. Donald was a soap and water man his entire life, and suddenly he was wearing something that smelled expensive and unfamiliar on evenings when he claimed to be at client dinners. I said nothing. I watched. I'm a patient woman. I always have been. Cynthia Reed had been his executive assistant for 4 years. I had met her at the company Christmas party in 2019. A trim woman in her late 30s, carefully put together, with a laugh that she aimed like a flashlight at whoever she most wanted to impress. At the time, I'd given her little thought. By 2022, I was giving her a great deal of thought. I didn't confront Donald. I'm not the type. Instead, I started paying closer attention to small things. A dinner receipt from a restaurant in Georgetown on a Tuesday. He said he'd been in Richmond. A hotel charge from Annapolis? Just one night, $340? On the credit card statement, he didn't know I still reviewed every month. I kept a small notebook. I wrote things down in a handwriting so neat it calmed me just to look at it. For 2 years, I gathered. I said nothing. I smiled at Sunday dinners. I asked about his golf game. I handed him his coffee the way he liked it. Black, 1 sugar. Every single morning. Then came March 14th, 2023. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way. I had been to the grocery store. I came home to find Donald sitting at the kitchen table in a suit I didn't recognize. Charcoal gray, well cut, not the kind of thing he bought without help. His hands were flat on the table. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something. "Margie," he said. He hadn't called me that in years. "Sit down." I set my grocery bags on the counter. I sat. He told me he wanted a divorce. He said it plainly, without cruelty, but without much kindness either. The way you cancel a subscription. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. He said he had found someone. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. And then he said the part he had clearly been waiting to say. He leaned back slightly, and I watched something shift in his face. A quiet confidence, almost paternal, as though he were doing me a difficult favor. I'll be taking the house and the business assets, he said. My attorney has structured a settlement. You'll receive $500 a month in support. That's fair, Margie. You should be grateful. You never really worked, not officially. Everything is in the company name. He believed that completely. I could see it in his eyes. I looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder I had mounted by the window 6 springs ago. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my grocery bags, walked to the refrigerator, and began putting things away. All right, Donald, I said. 3 days later, I drove to Richmond, not to Patricia's house, not yet, but to the office of a woman named Helen Cho, an estate and family law attorney I had consulted, quietly, 7 months earlier. I had been patient for 51 years. I was done being patient. Helen Cho's office was on the 5th floor of a brick building on West Franklin Street, with tall windows that looked out over the rooftops of the Fan District. I had first found her, through a friend of a friend, in a roundabout way that I'd been careful to keep roundabout. No emails, a phone call from the parking lot of a Whole Foods. Old habits from a lifetime of managing things quietly. She remembered me. She stood when I came in, and she had my file already open on the desk. He filed? She asked. He told me in person. Papers arrived by courier yesterday morning. I placed the envelope on her desk. He seems very confident. Helen opened the envelope without hurry. She was 50-something, compact and precise, with reading glasses she wore on a chain. I liked her because she never performed sympathy. She dealt in facts, and I had always preferred facts. While she read, I sat with my hands in my lap and let myself, for the first time, feel the full weight of the previous 72 hours. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect women my age to be either stoic monuments or crumbling messes, and I was neither. I was frightened. That is the plain truth. 51 years of a life, of a particular identity, of a home that smelled like my own garden, and a man sitting at a kitchen table telling me it was over, with the calm of someone who had already sorted out the practical details. The fear was real. It sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. But underneath the fear was something else. Something I had felt only a handful of times in my life. On the day I finished my accounting degree. On the day I quietly filed the paperwork that changed everything in 2004. A clarity. A sense of the board being set and myself knowing exactly where every piece stood. Donald thought he was divorcing a woman who had spent 51 years keeping house and staying graciously in the background. He had been watching the performance for so long that he had forgotten there was a performer. His attorney is citing marital assets, Helen said, setting down the papers. They've valued the business at approximately $12 million. He's claiming full ownership on the basis that you were never a named partner or officer. I know. Margie, she looked at me over her glasses. Tell me again about the Harrison Family Trust. And so I did. In 2004, after I had discovered the first affair, a younger woman, a real estate broker from Alexandria, a thing Donald had ended only because I had confronted him with bank records and threatened, quietly, to leave. We had gone to counseling. We had also, at my insistence, restructured our financial holdings. Donald had agreed to almost everything I asked in those months. He was ashamed, and shame makes people agreeable. What he had not fully understood, or perhaps had not bothered to read carefully enough, was that the restructuring included the creation of a revocable trust in my name alone, the Margaret Ann Harrison Revocable Trust, into which I had transferred, over the following 3 years, the majority of our appreciating assets, the property group's underlying real estate holdings, the investment accounts, the McLean house. All of it had been titled, legally and completely, to the trust. The business operated under the Harrison Property Group, LLC, of which Donald was the managing member. But the LLC's assets, its properties, its equity, were owned by the trust. My trust. Donald had signed the documents. He had signed them in 2004, 2005, and 2006, at the kitchen table with a glass of bourbon in his hand, because I had prepared the papers and I had explained them to him in terms that were accurate but not alarming. He trusted me with paperwork the way people trust a long-time pharmacist, completely without reading the label. I had never done anything improper. Every document was legitimate, reviewed by counsel, properly recorded. I had simply done what any careful accountant would do. I had made sure the assets were protected, and I had protected them in my name. "The trust is intact?" Helen asked. "Completely. I reviewed everything last fall." She sat back in her chair. "Then his claim to $12 million in marital assets is—" "Incorrect," I said. "Substantially incorrect." She looked at me for a moment, and I saw the corner of her mouth move. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about next steps." I drove home to McLean that afternoon with a list, not a written one. I kept it in my head, the way I had always kept the things that mattered most. First, secure all trust documentation with a second copy in a safe deposit box at a bank Donald did not use. Second, do not change my behavior at home. Do not give him any indication that I had done anything other than begin to accept my fate graciously. Third, gather evidence of his relationship with Cynthia to support any claim of dissipation of marital funds. The house was empty when I got back. Donald had been staying at what he called a friend's place in Georgetown. I knew whose place it was. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the cardinal feeder. Then I made myself a cup of tea, sat at the table where he had delivered his verdict, and opened my notebook. I wrote one line. "He thinks this is already over." Then I turned the page, picked up my pen, and began to work. Helen filed our response to Donald's petition on a Thursday morning in late March. It was a document of 22 pages, and on the surface, it was unremarkable. A standard counter-response citing marital contributions, requesting full financial discovery and disputing the asset valuation. Nothing in it mentioned the trust directly. Helen had been very deliberate about that. "Let them think they're dealing with a standard dispute," she said. "Let them spend money on depositions and valuations before we show our cards." I agreed. I had always believed in the value of well-timed information. I was in Richmond, staying with my daughter Patricia for what I told Donald was time to clear my head. Patricia was 53, a high school principal, practical and clear-eyed, and she had never warmed to her father's charm, the way that others did. She had, I think, watched me too closely over the years to be fooled by the performance. She did not ask many questions when I arrived with 2 suitcases. She simply put sheets on the guest bed and made pasta for dinner. I did not tell her everything yet. I needed to be sure before I brought my daughter into the machinery of it. It was during my second week at Patricia's house that things began to shift on Donald's end. His attorney, a man named Gregory Paulson, well regarded in Northern Virginia family law circles, the kind of lawyer you hired when you expected an easy win, sent Helen a letter noting that our filing had raised procedural complexities and requesting an extension on the discovery timeline. Helen forwarded it to me with a single comment. "They're digging." That meant Donald had started asking questions about the company accounts, about the property records, about things he had signed and apparently never thought about again. I imagined him calling his own accountant, the one he had hired himself in 2015, a man who had only ever seen the LLC's surface. The operating accounts, the revenue, the tax returns I had prepared carefully to show exactly what I intended them to show. Let them dig. They would find everything filed correctly and completely. And the more they looked, the more they would realize how little they actually controlled. But it was the second thing that happened that week that truly changed the nature of what I was doing. Patricia had a friend, a woman named Deborah Salter, who worked in commercial lending at a bank in Tyson's Corner, who had, years before, handled a refinancing for Harrison Property Group. Deborah had always been fond of me. On a Wednesday evening, she came for dinner at Patricia's house, ostensibly a social visit, and she brought with her, folded in her coat pocket, a printed email chain. She set it on the table after the dishes were cleared and Patricia had gone to put the children to bed. "I thought you should know," she said, simply. The emails were between Cynthia Reed and a mortgage broker named Stephen Park, dating from 2019. In them, Cynthia referred to Don with a familiarity that made the timeline unambiguous. She had been with him for at least 4 years before I knew. And in one email, a casual one, the most damaging kind, she wrote something that I read 3 times in the quiet of Patricia's dining room. "Don says once the old setup is sorted, everything transfers to us. He's been planning this for 2 years. I just have to be patient a little longer. The old setup, everything transfers." He had been planning the divorce for at least 2 years. He had been telling Cynthia that the assets would come to them. He had been, in other words, counting money that was not his to count. I folded the email chain and placed it in my bag. I thanked Deborah quietly. After she left, I sat alone in Patricia's kitchen for a long time, listening to the sound of the house settling around me. I had spent 51 years building something with a man who had been cataloging it for someone else. The fear I'd felt 2 weeks ago had not left me, but it had changed shape. It was harder now, more angular. The kind of feeling that doesn't make you want to sit down. It makes you want to stand up very straight. I called Helen the next morning. "I have documentary evidence of a multi-year affair and evidence that the respondent made representations to a third party regarding marital assets he does not legally control," I said. There was a pause. Where did it come from? A credible source who will provide an affidavit if needed. Another pause. "Margie," Helen said, "I think it's time we let them know what the trust actually contains." "Not yet," I said. "Let Paulson finish his discovery first. I want Donald to stand in front of a judge having told his attorney that he owns $12 million. Then we show them the trust." Helen was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while. Since 2004, I said, give or take. Discovery in a contested divorce is a formal process, governed by rules and deadlines, and on paper, it is bloodless. In practice, it is the legal equivalent of turning someone's house upside down and shaking it. Paulson had requested all financial records related to Harrison Property Group dating back 15 years. Helen had complied, fully, completely, without omission. Every deed, every transfer, every trust document. Organized in 4 banker's boxes delivered to Paulson's office on a Wednesday morning in April. Helen told me later that Paulson had called her at noon that same day. She described his voice as very careful, the kind of careful that a confident man adopts when he realizes he has badly miscalculated. He asked if the trust documents were complete, she told me. "What did you say?" I said they were, and I said that if he had questions about the provenance or validity of any instrument, we were prepared to provide full accounting history, original signatures, and notarial records going back to 2004. I thought about Donald receiving that phone call from Paulson. I tried to put myself in that kitchen. Not mine, but Cynthia's Georgetown apartment, which I now knew from Patricia's private research was on the 4th floor of a building on N Street. And imagined his face. I did not feel pleasure exactly. It was more like the particular relief of a long-held breath finally released. Donald did not call me. He came to McLean. He had a key. I had not yet changed the locks, which was a choice I had made deliberately. And he let himself in on a Saturday morning when he knew I would be there. Because I had returned to the house the previous week to collect additional documents. He was not alone. Cynthia was with him. This surprised me. I had not expected him to bring her, but I understood the calculation. She was there to unsettle me, to make the confrontation more complete, to remind me of my replacement. She stood slightly behind him in my front hallway, in a camel-colored coat, looking at my house with the careful neutrality of a woman trying not to appear to be measuring for curtains. Donald's face was different than it had been at the kitchen table in March. The paternal confidence was gone. What was there instead was something older and less controlled. "What did you do?" he said. I was sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee. I did not stand up. "I don't know what you mean, Donald." "The trust." His voice was tight. "You never told me what was in that trust. You had me sign those papers and you never told me." "You signed documents prepared by a licensed attorney," I said. "You were invited to review them with your own counsel at the time. You chose not to." "That was 20 years ago. I didn't think—" "No," I said. "You didn't." Cynthia stepped forward then. Up close, she was prettier than her photographs, and tireder, and she looked at me with an expression I had not expected. Something complicated, almost beseeching. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, "we just want to talk. This doesn't have to be adversarial." "It became adversarial in March," I said, "when your attorney filed a petition claiming ownership of assets that don't belong to my husband." Donald's jaw tightened. "I built that company. You were the managing member of an LLC that operated on assets held in my trust. I have 20 years of records establishing that distinction." I set down my coffee cup. "If Gregory Paulson has told you otherwise, I'd suggest a second opinion." What happened next, I had not quite anticipated, though I should have. Donald moved toward me, not physically threatening, but looming in the way large men sometimes do when they feel their authority draining away, and said something that I am still capable of recalling word for word. "If you fight me on this, Margie, I will make sure everyone knows what you really are. I'll tell Patricia you manipulated me for years. I'll tell the court you hid assets. I'll say the trust was created fraudulently, that you deceived me. You want to drag this into the open? I'll drag it." I looked at him for a long time. "Donald," I said, "every document I signed was prepared by a licensed attorney, reviewed by a court recorder, and properly filed. You are welcome to allege fraud. I look forward to the discovery process that would follow." He stared at me. Cynthia put her hand on his arm. After a moment, they left. I heard my front door close. I heard their car back out of the driveway. Then I sat alone in my living room for a long time. I was shaking slightly. Not from fear, I think, but from the sheer physical effort of holding that much composure under that much pressure. I am 74 years old, and I am not unbreakable. I simply know where my brakes are, and I guard them carefully. I called Patricia that evening and told her I was going to spend a few days at the small lake house in Rappahannock County, a property Donald had always dismissed as too quiet, which had made me love it all the more over the years. I drove up on Sunday morning, and for 4 days I walked and read and cooked for myself and slept 9 hours a night. I needed to be rested for what came next. The call from Cynthia came on a Tuesday, my 3rd day at the lake house. I was sitting on the back porch with a blanket over my knees and a novel I hadn't managed to concentrate on, watching the water move in the way it does in early spring. Restless, gray-brown, not quite committed to any particular direction. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and something in me knew before I answered. "Mrs. Harrison?" Her voice was different on the phone than it had been in my living room. Softer, carefully positioned somewhere between conciliation and warmth. "This is Cynthia Reed. I hope I'm not disturbing you." I didn't ask how she had gotten my number. It didn't matter. "What can I do for you, Cynthia?" A small pause. Very calculated. "I wanted to speak with you. Without the attorneys, without Donald. Woman to woman. I think there's been a lot of pain on all sides. And I believe we could resolve this in a way that leaves everyone in a better place. I watched a heron pick its way along the far bank. What kind of resolution did you have in mind? She had prepared for this. She offered, in measured and reasonable-sounding language, a settlement in which I would receive a lump sum of $1.5 million, the McLean house, and a structured monthly payment. Slightly higher than Donald's initial offer, she noted, as if this were a significant gesture. In exchange, I would sign over control of the trust assets to Donald, dissolve the trust as a marital settlement, and agree to a mutual non-disparagement clause. $1.5 million from a $12 million estate that was legally mine. I let her finish. I waited a beat. Cynthia, I said, I appreciate you calling, but I'm not interested in a settlement that transfers my legal assets to your benefit. Mrs. Harrison, I'm going to ask you not to contact me directly again. If you or Donald have a proposal, please have your attorney communicate it to Helen Cho. I paused. I hope you're enjoying the view from my husband's Georgetown apartment. I ended the call. I sat with the phone in my lap, and the heron moved slowly along the bank, patient and precise. And I felt, not triumphant exactly, but settled. Like a door I had been holding against a strong wind had finally been bolted from the inside. What I felt most sitting there was the strange particular clarity of having been underestimated by the right people at the right moment. I stayed one more night at the lake house and then drove back to McLean. That evening, I sat down with Patricia in my kitchen, in my house, and I told her everything. The trust, the plan, the 2004 restructuring, the emails from Deborah, the confrontation with Donald and Cynthia in the hallway, the phone call at the lake. Patricia listened without interrupting. She was her father's physical opposite. Slight, still, with a habit of folding her hands when she was thinking hard. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Mom, she said, you've known how to do all of this for 20 years. Since your grandfather taught me to read a balance sheet, I said. Yes. She reached across the kitchen table and took my hand. She didn't say anything else, which was, I thought, exactly right. The following week, I also told Ruth Abernethy. Ruth had been my closest friend for 37 years. We had met in a Bible study group in 1986, remained friends through every revision of both our lives, and she was the only person outside of Helen Cho who had known even the outline of what I was doing. She came for lunch, and I told her the rest, and she listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, and when I finished, she poured us both more iced tea and said, "So he thought he could put you out to pasture at 74, and he didn't realize the pasture was yours." That is essentially correct, I said. She laughed, a long, real laugh, and for the first time in months, I laughed too. It didn't solve anything. Donald and Cynthia were still out there, still maneuvering, still paying Gregory Paulson to find a crack in 20 years of careful work. But I was not alone in it. I had my daughter. I had Ruth. I had Helen. And I had the documents. They came on a Saturday afternoon in May, and this time they called ahead. Donald left a voicemail. Formal, almost stilted, as though he had written it out first. He said he wanted to meet. He said there was no agenda other than to talk like adults. He said he was sorry for how things had been handled. I played the message twice. Then I called Helen. Should I see them? I asked. Absolutely not without me present, she said, or without recording the conversation, which in Virginia requires their consent. If they want a meeting, make it formal. I thought about it for a day. Then I called Donald back and told him they were welcome to come to the house on Saturday at 2 o'clock, but that I would be recording the conversation and that he should be aware of this in advance. There was a pause on the line, brief but real. He said that was fine. When they arrived, Cynthia had clearly given thought to her appearance. She wore something understated, a pale blue blouse, minimal jewelry, and she had done something different with her hair. Softer, less office polished. Donald wore a suit with no tie. Both choices were calculated to seem less threatening, and the calculation was visible to me the moment I opened the door. I had seen Donald dress for 100 negotiations. I knew what his deliberate casualness looked like. I brought them into the living room. I had set out coffee. I had dressed simply. I had placed my phone on the side table, recording application open, which they could both clearly see. I did not offer them a tour of the house, which was mine, or apologize for the state of the garden, which was blooming beautifully without anyone's apology. Donald began with an apology. It was a considered one, acknowledging that the way he had approached the divorce conversation had been abrupt and without sensitivity. He acknowledged that 51 years deserved more respect than he had shown. He said he still cared about my well-being. He said this last part looking at his hands, which told me more than the words did. I listened. I said nothing. Then Cynthia spoke. And this was where the mask began to slip. Not all at once, but in the way ice does. Gradually, at the edges, then faster. She said, gently, reasonably, with a small, compassionate tilt of her head, that continuing this legal battle would be devastating for everyone involved. She said that the kind of protracted court case we were heading toward would exhaust our resources, your resources. She said Patricia would be dragged into it. She mentioned, with soft emphasis, my age. She said that women in my position often found that the stress of prolonged litigation had serious health consequences. You're 74, she said. You deserve peace, a comfortable life, time with your grandchildren, not years in a courtroom. I noticed she said your grandchildren, not our, as though she were a neutral party offering disinterested advice, and not the woman who had been conducting an affair with my husband for at least 4 years. The grammatical distance was telling. These were not the words of someone who felt guilt. These were the words of someone who had decided guilt was an inefficiency. I looked at her. Cynthia, I said, when you say women in my position, what position exactly do you mean? A small hesitation. Someone who legally owns the majority of the assets in question, I said, or someone you expected to be frightened enough to sign them away. The gentleness left her face. Not dramatically. She was disciplined. But I saw it go. Donald leaned forward. The apology in his voice was gone, replaced by something harder, the tone I recognized from 40 years of boardroom negotiations. Margie, the trust will be challenged. Our attorneys have found grounds. This will get ugly. Is that what you want? At your age, with your health? My health is excellent, I said. The court case alone will take years. You could settle today and have a life. Or you can spend the next 3 years in depositions. He spread his hands. Think about what makes sense. What he meant by what makes sense was, think about surrender. He had used that phrase in business dealings for decades whenever he was in a stronger position, and wanted the other party to recognize it without the indignity of being told directly. I had watched him use it on contractors, on partners, on a nephew who had once tried to dispute a land boundary. It was his closing line. The words of a man who believed the conversation was already over. The difference this time was that he was wrong about who held the stronger position. I reached over and stopped the recording on my phone. I looked at both of them. Donald, I said, you have just, on recording, cited my age twice as a reason I should surrender legal assets that belong to me. Cynthia, you referenced my health. I want you to know that I have noted both of those things, and so has the recording. The room was very quiet. I think you should go now, I said. Cynthia stood first. Her face had gone past the careful mask and arrived somewhere genuine. Not quite anger, but its near neighbor. Donald stood more slowly, and for a moment He looked at me across the living room with an expression I could not entirely categorize. There was frustration in it, and something that might have been, in another person, a flicker of something like regret. Or perhaps I was simply looking for it. They left without another word. I sat down in the chair after I heard the front door close. The house was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon was still bright, the kind of May light that has real warmth in it, and it came through the front windows in long, pale rectangles across the floor. I had washed those windows myself in April. I had painted that room in 2009. Every surface in that house had been chosen, placed, or cared for by my hands. And 2 people had just sat in the middle of it and told me I was too old to fight for it. My hands were steady, but my heart was going faster than I would have liked, and I sat with it for a while. The fear, the unwanted awareness of my own age, and the real possibility that even correct legal positions were not guaranteed outcomes, that Donald could spend enough money to make the next few years genuinely difficult. He knew the local business community. He had relationships. He was not, despite everything, a stupid man. But here is what I had learned about fear in 74 years. It is not an obstacle. It is a signal. And what it was signaling to me, sitting in my living room with the recording on my phone and 20 years of careful documents filed in 4 jurisdictions, was that I was standing in exactly the right place. I picked up my phone and called Helen. "They came," I said. "They mentioned my age, my health, and the length of the litigation. It's all on the recording." A pause. "Good," she said. "That's very good, Margie." The preliminary hearing was set for the 2nd week of June, a Tuesday morning, in the Fairfax County Circuit Court. Helen had requested a judicial review of asset ownership prior to any settlement mediation, a procedural step that Paulson had fought and lost. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Clara Mwangi, had granted it on the grounds that the ownership dispute was foundational to any further proceedings. I had been to that courthouse before, years ago, for a property dispute involving a contractor. A minor thing, resolved quickly. It had the particular smell of all government buildings, carpet cleaner and recycled air, and the faint institutional anxiety of people waiting for decisions to be made about their lives. I arrived early, 15 minutes before the scheduled time, and I sat in the corridor for a moment and simply breathed. The building was already busy. Other cases, other families, other accumulations of broken arrangements being sorted through the machinery of the law. I found it, oddly, steadying. Whatever was happening to me was not unique. People had been walking into buildings like this for centuries to make the courts witness what they already knew to be true. Helen was already there, with a paralegal named James, who had spent the previous 2 weeks organizing our documents into a presentation that was, I thought, something close to beautiful in its precision. 4 binders, color-coded by category, with tabbed indices. James had the focused, slightly caffeinated energy of a young man who had stayed up late doing important work and knew it. Donald and Paulson were already seated at the respondents' table when I came in. Donald did not look at me when I entered. Cynthia was not present. This was a legal proceeding, not a personal confrontation, and even Paulson had apparently decided that her presence would not be strategic. I noticed that Donald was wearing the same charcoal gray suit he had worn the morning he told me he wanted a divorce. I don't know if this was intentional. I don't know what it would have meant if it was. Judge Mwangi was direct and unhurried. She had read the briefs. She asked Paulson to summarize the respondent's position on asset ownership, which he did. Harrison Property Group was a marital asset built through Donald Harrison's professional efforts over 50 years, and the marital estate should be divided accordingly. Paulson was good at this, measured, credible, presenting Donald's position in the most reasonable light available. I gave him that. He was doing the best he could with what he had been given. Then she asked Helen for the petitioner's position. Helen stood. She was, in that moment, exactly the person I had needed her to be: unhurried, accurate, and completely without drama. She walked the court through the history of the Margaret Ann Harrison Revocable Trust, beginning in 2004. She produced the original trust instrument with Donald's signature on page 11. She produced the deed transfers for each of the 14 properties held by the trust. She produced the LLC operating agreement, which listed the trust as the sole owner of the company's real property assets. She produced Donald's signature on each document. Then she produced 3 tax years in which Donald Harrison had personally filed returns listing the trust assets as belonging to his spouse. Filings prepared, she noted, by his own accountant and signed by him under penalty of perjury. The courtroom was not dramatic in the way that courts are on television. It was quiet. The only sound for a long stretch was the judge making notes, and, once, the distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the corridor. I was aware of my own breathing. I was aware of the particular texture of the chair beneath me. I had the sensation, which I have read others describe and had never quite believed until that moment, of time moving at a different speed than usual, not slowly but with unusual clarity, each second distinct and fully present. Paulson asked for time to review the documents. Judge Mwangi gave him 30 minutes. I sat at the petitioner's table, and I did not look at Donald. I looked at the middle distance, the way you do when you are waiting for something you have been waiting for a very long time, and you find, when it arrives, that the waiting has made you calm rather than eager. After 30 minutes, Paulson approached the bench for a sidebar with both attorneys. I could not hear what was said. Donald sat alone at his table, and I did not need to look at him to know what was happening in his face, because I had known that face for 51 years. The particular way his jaw set when a deal went wrong. The particular stillness that came over him when he understood that a situation had moved entirely beyond his control. When Helen returned to the table, she bent close to me. "Paulson is asking for a continuance," she said quietly. "He needs time to challenge the validity of the trust." "On what grounds?" "He hasn't specified. He's buying time." "Can he get it?" Helen looked at me. "Possibly. Mwangi might give him 30 days. I thought about 30 more days. About Donald and Cynthia in that Georgetown apartment, calling attorneys, moving through the stress of disintegrating certainty. About what 30 days of delay would cost me, not in money, but in energy, in the sustained effort of holding a position under pressure. And then I thought about something else. Something I had been holding in reserve precisely for a moment when it would matter most. "Let me see the recording from the house," I said. Helen understood immediately. She pulled out a tablet, and we listened together, quietly, both leaning in, to Donald's voice. "The court case alone will take years. You could settle today and have a life. And Cynthia's. You're 74. You deserve peace." Helen stood and addressed the judge. She noted that subsequent to the preliminary filing, the respondent and a third party had attended an unscheduled meeting at the petitioner's residence, during which both had made reference to the petitioner's age and health as reasons she should abandon her legal claim. She submitted that this constituted an attempt to pressure a litigant on the basis of age, and asked that the recording be entered into the record as supplementary evidence of the respondent's approach to these proceedings. Paulson objected. The judge overruled him. She played it. In that quiet courtroom, Donald's voice filled the air, and Cynthia's, and then the sound of my own voice. Clear, even, asking what position exactly they meant by women in my position. There was a quality to hearing it in that formal space. A courtroom with a judge, with a court reporter transcribing every word. That was different from hearing it in Helen's office. It sounded, in that room, like what it was, a recorded attempt to use a 74-year-old woman's age against her in a legal dispute over property that was legally hers. Donald was very still, and then he was not. He turned to Paulson and said something sharp and low, and Paulson put a hand on his arm, and Donald said something else, and his voice was rising now. Not to shouting, but past the controlled register he had maintained all morning, audible enough that several people in the room turned to look. Judge Mwangi looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who has seen this particular unraveling before and is entirely unimpressed by it. "Mr. Harrison," she said, with the precise, measured authority of someone who has spent decades in a room with people who have forgotten where they are. "Compose yourself, please." Donald sat back. His face was flushed. Paulson leaned toward him and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Donald stared at the table. I looked at him then, for the first time that morning. 51 years. The silver hair, the broad shoulders, the hands that had once signed 14 documents without reading them because he trusted the woman who had placed the pen in his hand. And what I felt, looking at him across that room, was not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. It was something quieter and more complete than any of those things. It was the feeling of having told the truth in a room built for it, to someone with the authority to hear it. Judge Mwangi denied the continuance. She issued a preliminary ruling that the trust assets were the separate legal property of Margaret Ann Harrison, not subject to marital division, pending a full evidentiary hearing. She ordered both parties to return in 60 days. Donald left the courtroom without speaking to me. Helen and I walked out into the June sunlight, and I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed. The air was warm and smelled faintly of cut grass from the park across the street. An ordinary summer day in Fairfax, Virginia. Ordinary for everyone except me. "You did well," Helen said. "I had good documents," I said. She smiled. "That too." The 60 days were not quiet. Paulson filed a motion challenging the 2004 trust on grounds of alleged undue influence, the argument being that Donald had signed the trust documents without fully understanding their implications, and that I, as the party who had prepared and presented them, had exploited a position of trust. It was, Helen told me, a predictable argument. It was also a weak one. We had 3 things working against it. First, the documents had been prepared not by me personally, but by an estate attorney named Richard Park, who was still in practice in Bethesda, and who provided an affidavit stating that he had met with Donald Harrison alone, explained the trust instrument fully, offered him the opportunity to have independent counsel review it, and that Donald had declined, stating that he trusted his wife's judgment on financial matters. Second, Donald had not merely signed the documents in 2004. He had referenced the trust in his own communications, in letters to the company's bank, in emails to the LLC's property manager as recently as 2019. A man who had been deceived into signing documents he didn't understand would not, over the following 15 years, casually reference those documents in business correspondence. Third, and most definitively, Donald's own tax returns. You cannot, under oath, report your wife's trust assets as her separate property for 15 consecutive years, and then claim in a divorce proceeding that you didn't know those assets were hers. The evidentiary hearing took place on a Thursday in August in the same Fairfax courtroom before Judge Mwangi. Paulson presented his case over 2 hours. Richard Park testified. Donald's own accountant, a man named Gerald Price, who had been told nothing by Donald about the nature of the hearing, testified about the tax returns and confirmed that he had prepared them based on documentation indicating the trust was Mrs. Harrison's separate property. Donald testified briefly. He said he hadn't understood what he was signing. He said it had all happened very fast, that Margie had handled everything, that he'd trusted her. Helen cross-examined him for 45 minutes. She introduced the 2019 email to the property manager, in which Donald had written, in his own words, "Regarding the Potomac Falls property, all title matters should be directed to the Harrison Family Trust, as the property is held in Margaret's name." She introduced 3 other instances of similar acknowledgement, spanning 12 years. By the end, Donald's testimony had become inconsistent in ways that were not aggressive or dramatic, but were, in the clinical language of a courtroom, simply not credible. He had contradicted himself on the question of when he first realized the trust held the properties. He had changed his account of the 2004 meetings. Paulson did not help him with redirect. Judge Mwangi issued her final ruling 11 days later in a written order. The Margaret Ann Harrison Revocable Trust was valid, properly executed, and not subject to marital division. The real property assets held by the trust, 14 properties, valued at approximately $9.4 million, were the sole and separate property of Margaret Ann Harrison. The operating accounts of Harrison Property Group, which were marital property, totaled approximately $1.1 million, of which Margaret was entitled to 50%. Donald's claim of ownership over the trust assets was denied in full. Donald would receive half of the operating accounts, approximately $550,000, his personal savings, his car, the Georgetown apartment lease, which was in his name. He would pay Helen's fees, as the court had found his challenge to the trust to be without merit. He would pay me $2,200 per month in spousal support for 7 years, given the disparity in our post-settlement financial positions. I read the order in Helen's office, sitting across from her in the same chair where I had sat 8 months earlier, and I read it twice, slowly, the way I read every important document. Then I set it on the desk. "Is there anything he can appeal?" I asked. "He can try," Helen said. "Paulson won't encourage it. The record is very clean." I nodded. I sat for a moment with the quiet of it. "What will he do?" I asked. Not strategically, but genuinely. I had spent 51 years with this man, and I was curious, in the way you are curious about the weather after a storm has passed. Helen considered. "I think," she said carefully, "he'll do what people do when they've run out of options. He'll adjust." I thanked her. I paid the remainder of her retainer. I drove home to McLean, to my house, to my kitchen, to the cardinal feeder outside the window that I had mounted 6 springs ago, and that was still there, bright red against the August afternoon. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table where Donald had delivered his verdict 5 months earlier. I thought about what I would do with the rest of the afternoon. Then I picked up the phone and called Patricia. "It's done," I said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Come for dinner." I did. A year passed. Then another. And then it was the summer of 2025, and I was 76 years old and sitting in the garden of my McLean house with a glass of iced tea and the early evening light coming through the oak trees the way it does in July, golden and very slow. And I was thinking about how differently I had expected this time of my life to look. I had expected decline. That is the honest answer. I had expected the kind of managed diminishment that comes after a long marriage ends, a slow contraction of the world into something smaller and quieter and less. I had not expected expansion, but expansion was what happened. The 14 trust properties required management, and I found, once I was no longer spending my energy maintaining the careful equilibrium of a marriage that had been more performance than partnership for the better part of a decade, that I had quite a lot of energy for management. I hired a property management company for the residential holdings and retained direct oversight of the 3 commercial properties, which I enjoyed. I met with tenants. I reviewed lease renewals. I made decisions. I took a trip I had wanted to take for 30 years, 2 weeks in Portugal, with Ruth, staying in a small hotel in Lisbon that looked out over the Tagus River, eating well, walking slowly, talking without agenda. Ruth was 71 and had recently retired, and she was the ideal travel companion. Curious about everything, with no interest in rushing. Patricia and I were closer than we had been in years. The strange intimacy of having gone through something difficult together had dissolved a formality between us that I hadn't quite realized was there. Her daughters, my granddaughters, spent 2 weeks with me in August, and I taught the elder one to bake the same apple cake my mother had taught me. In the spring of 2025, I began volunteering twice a week with a financial literacy program at a community center in Arlington, teaching basic accounting and personal finance to adults who had never had access to that kind of education. It was small work and useful, and it gave me a reason to be somewhere other than my own house twice a week, which is, I have come to believe, one of the underrated requirements of a good life. I did not think often about Donald. When I did, it was with something I can only describe as a low-grade, complicated sadness. The recognition of waste. The waste of what we might have been if he had been a different kind of man. But there is no use in cataloging waste. You can only note it and move on. What I knew about Donald's life, I knew through Patricia and the ordinary mechanisms of a small professional community. He had sold the operating business for considerably less than he had expected, because a business whose asset base has been removed is worth considerably less than it appears. He had received somewhere around $400,000 for the LLC's goodwill and the Harrison Property Group name. He and Cynthia had married in November 2023. By the following spring, the marriage had become a significantly more difficult proposition than either of them had anticipated. Cynthia had believed she was marrying a wealthy man with a thriving business. What she had married was a man in his late 70s with $550,000 in liquid assets, a spousal support obligation to me, and a reputation in Northern Virginia business circles that had been quietly damaged by the divorce proceedings. By mid-2025, they were living in a condominium in Reston. Not a bad life by most measures, but a significantly contracted one from what had been promised. Cynthia had returned to work in a property management role at a firm with no connection to the Harrison name. I did not feel satisfaction in learning these things, or rather, I felt a pale shadow of it, and I was human enough not to be ashamed. What I felt more than anything was the equanimity that comes from having done something correctly. Not vindictively, not recklessly, but correctly. The cardinal came back to the feeder every morning. The garden was in better shape than it had been in years. That July evening, sitting with my iced tea in the golden light, I was not waiting for anything. I was simply present in my own life, in my own house, in a garden I had planted myself over 30 years. It was exactly enough. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And thank you sincerely for listening.